In 2009, I published an article called Name-Based Cluster Sampling. It's an example of how you can use cluster sampling to generate a randomly chosen group of people without having to have a list of all those people. This was an unusual example. I got the idea in 2006 when I was looking at a website called Baby Name Wizard. Baby Name Wizard is an amusing way to look at how names change over time. If I enlarge the screen, all of the names, pink for girls, blue for boys, are shown in this strata from the 1880s until modern times. If I just choose boys, for example, you'll see that back in the 1880s, very popular names were Charles, George, John, and William. They were so popular that all of these live births, 500,000 births, were generated names like Charles was number 5, George was number 4. In the mid-1950s, popular names we can see were David, James, Michael, Richard, and Robert, all of which are much less popular nowadays. With girls, we can see that Mary was a very popular name until the 1960s or 1970s. There were brief moments for Helen, Dorothy. I remember a lot of my classmates named Linda when I was in school in the 1960s. Jennifer, certainly in the 70s and 80s when I started to teach. But those aren't the names that are popular nowadays. Let's take the example of Olivia. In 2014, it was the number 2 baby name for a girl. If we double click on that, we'll see that Olivia is a fairly recent phenomenon. There were girls, there were maybe 200 per million births in the 1880s all the way up through the 1970s, but it really shot up in the 90s and the 2000s, and now Olivia is way up there. I would guess in 10 years the name Olivia for a baby will be less popular. These things are kind of trendy. If I were to type in my own name, Douglas, I can see that it was not an unpopular name in the 1950s when I was born. It was ranked 28th out of all the other names, still beaten soundly by the Richards and the Roberts and the John and the Michaels, but it was a chance of finding a Doug in my class. You can see by the year 2013, Douglas as a name is ranked 541 out of the 1,000 names that they rank, so it's not very popular. You can type your own name into the Baby Wizard just by going to babynamewizard.com. But what does this have to do with cluster sampling? Fortunately for me, the Social Security Administration tracks the popularity of first names by decade. I was doing a study about college students and their use of iPods in 2006, so I knew that my students, that my sample was on Facebook, which was new at the time and limited to college students, and that I could search them by their name, but I couldn't search them by a list. So I came up with this technique of taking all the names, in this case the girl names from the 1980s. The most popular name was Jessica. Over 3% of the babies born in the 1980s were named Jessica. Another 3% were named Jennifer, followed by Amanda, Ashley, Sarah, Stephanie, Melissa, Nicole, Elizabeth. Those were the top 10 names in the 1980s. Olivia was ranked 195th in the 1980s. You can see how much Olivia has become popular. As you scroll to the bottom of the list, you start to get into unusual names for girls, like, well, there's a Matthew and a Joshua. That's a really unfortunate name for a girl. At the very bottom of the list, you see a lot of misspelled names, like a misspelled Brittany, a couple different ways. One of the most unpopular names of all time, Bertha, which if you go to the Baby Name Wizard, Bertha was a pretty popular name in the 1880s. My grandmother was born in the 1880s, and she had one of the top 10 names at the time. It was Bessie. Knowing something about randomly generated numbers, I chose this column here labeled N to randomly choose a list of 500 numbers every time I hit the F4 key, which I'm going to do now. Every time I hit the F4 key in Excel, it recalculates a variable that I've put together. And in the random column, I'm using the formula RAND open and close parentheses, which generates a random number. It tries to fit that number into a table of names looked up using column D, the spaces between these different variables in column D. It may sound a little complicated, but by using this formula, I can generate 500 names at a time, and I'm almost certain to get an Ashley and a Sarah and a Stephanie, because those were so popular. There's a Jennifer, because those were so popular in the 1980s. By assembling this column F of names arranged in order of their popularity, they've been clustered proportionate to the size of the sample. So whenever I choose names, I have a better chance of choosing the most popular names, but I still have a chance of getting a Jasmine or a Danielle or a Kelsey, because those names are out there too. Column M was used to generate another random number, and for this I used column K, which represents the first two letters of all the last names in the United States. Just as the Social Security Administration keeps track of first names, the U.S. Census Bureau keeps track of all 90,000 most popular last names. My table wouldn't work very well if I tried to put all 90,000 in, so I just took the first two letters from each name, and I found out which ones were the most popular. HA is the combination that starts most names in the United States. Almost 2.5% of the names in the United States start with the letter HA, followed by MA, PE, JA, CO, RO, BR, and so forth. So by combining these two randomly generated numbers, I was able to generate in columns P and Q a random first name and a random two combination of their last name. The reason I did this was because I knew that Facebook would allow me to search for names randomly from their directory. They wouldn't give me a list of all the names of everybody on Facebook, but I could find them using these name clusters that were proportionate to their distribution, at least in the 1980s. I had my students look them up and find some person out there that matched the conditions, and those people received randomly a copy of a survey that I had my students send to them with a short message saying, "You don't know me, but I'm doing this for course credit. Won't you please help me?" Begging for a response. And it worked pretty well. Unfortunately, since that time, Facebook really clamped down on duplicate messages. I tried to do this again in 2010, and they shut down my survey. One of my graduate students tried it in a different way, sending it to fewer people, and she lost her Facebook account for a couple of weeks, which she was not too happy about. So for finding people on Facebook, this method is dead. But as an example of cluster sampling, it's still pretty unique. At least I was able to get a publication out of the method.